Dead America, El Paso, Creeping Death Part 5. Dead America, the Second Month. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. The high-pitched ringing of an ancient analog alarm clock filled the air in Leon's bedroom. This long-forgotten relic from a time before digital clocks had suddenly become relevant again, thanks to the lack of power in most of the town. The dead weren't all that this apocalypse was bringing back to life. The sudden noise didn't bother or startle Leon as he laid there awake, pretty much since the time he'd crawled into bed. The weight of a million-strong army of the dead marching their way to Fabens was too much to overcome for a good night's sleep. In less than 48 hours, the little town would be facing off with the zombies, and there wasn't anything he or anyone else could do to prevent it. The only thing they could do was delay it, giving them more time to prepare for the inevitable. Finally, after several seconds of ringing, Leon reached over and smacked the top of the clock, ending the racket. He picked it up and stared at it, giving time for his eyes to adjust to read the slightly glowing numerals. "This clock is so old the numbers might be radioactive," he thought. "Should probably keep it away from the zombies, because the last thing we need is radioactive ghouls roaming around." He chuckled to himself, amazed that such a thought would come into his head during this time. Not just the threat, but also because it was 2 a.m, and too early to be awake. But he didn't have a choice. None of them did. The marching horde didn't care about what time it was or how inconvenient it was to start the day that early. They just kept putting one foot in front of the other, marching right down the interstate. And if they decided to take a break, there were a million of their friends behind to push them along. Leon pulled himself up, sitting at the edge of the bed for a few moments to collect himself. He lingered for a full minute, not wanting to get moving. "Come on, time to get going," he urged himself silently. "Satellite is going to be overhead in 20, and company is coming soon after." He groaned as he dragged himself out of bed, not bothering to even put on a fresh set of clothes. Not that he really had any clean ones to begin with, since laundry wasn't exactly at the top of anyone's list this week. He grabbed a flashlight by the front door and walked outside, but shoved it in his pocket under the moonlight. It was big and bright, not quite full, but close enough. He looked up at the twinkling stars, not a single cloud in the sky. "At least one thing is going right today," he thought bitterly. He walked towards the command center. The town was mostly silent as the defensive setups were being done in individual houses at that point, rather than on the front lines. As he approached the bridge barricade over the drainage ditch, he paused to admire the work. The structure had improved dramatically over the past few days, with more reinforcements being put in place. The ditch itself left a lot to be desired, however, as the best they could muster had been spiking the sides with makeshift spears. Rebar, wooden fencing, and even sticks from trees stuck out of the dirt. It was DIY to be sure, and he shook his head in defeat. "If all we get is 100 of those things, then we might be all right," he thought, sighing heavily. "Anything more, and they'll just power their way through this." He climbed over the bridge barricade, and at the top he paused, looking along the ditch once again. Dread rolled in his gut, but he raised his chin at the level of effort that had gone into it. "We may go down," he thought. "Hell, we may go down hard. But it's not going to be from a lack of effort." Leon hopped down, ruminating on the work the civilians had put into the town's defenses. Most of the people in Fabens had been discarded by the cartel, deemed unworthy of food and shelter. From the looks of things, they'd taken it personally. When he reached the command center, he took one last deep breath of the crisp night air and then opened the door, heading inside. He pulled out the flashlight to see what he was doing, making his way to the satellite computer to flip it on. As he hit the switch, the monitor flickered, sending a dull glow across the room. The center of the screen was blacked out, and his throat tightened with concern. Upon closer inspection, relief washed over him when he realized someone had stuck a post-it note to the monitor. He pulled it off and pointed the flashlight at it, reading, "I never woke up this early for my husband, and I'm sure as hell not starting it now for you. Coffee is in the maker, just hit start on the burner. Good luck today. Ethel." Leon chuckled to himself, shaking his head and pocketing the note before heading to the coffee maker. "Don't blame you one bit, Ethel," he murmured, as he hit the switch to start the burner underneath the old campfire coffee maker. He headed back to the computer, sitting down and watching the final boot-up sequence. While this was happening, the front door opened, startling him. He hadn't been expecting anyone else to be up this early. Leon turned to face Rufus, who walked in quietly. "Not interrupting anything, am I?" he asked as he shut the door behind him with a soft click. "Nah, you're good," Leon replied with a wave. "Just didn't expect to see anybody else up yet, since we're not getting started for another half hour or so." Rufus shrugged. "Being up this early wasn't my first choice either. But apparently the older you get, the earlier your body wants you to get up," he admitted. "Pretty sure I'm only a couple years away from my body wanting to get up before I go to bed." "Yeah, this shit is giving me flashbacks to my military days," Leon replied with a chuckle. "One thing about covert ops is that they rarely start around noon." The older man raised an eyebrow. "Covert, huh?" he asked. "Yeah, ran a few of those myself. Wasn't my main area of expertise. But whenever they needed something blown up, it meant my wake-up call was way earlier than I would like." He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "What kind of stuff did you do?" Leon pointed to the shelf over the satellite computer, which displayed a very powerful military-grade sniper rifle. Rufus smirked and nodded. "I was wondering if that was practical or just for decoration," he said. "I take it you're good with it?" "I'd like to think so," Leon replied, leaning back in his chair. "So, if that was your tool of the trade," the older man drawled, "how did you get into all this fancy computer stuff?" He waved a hand vaguely at the monitor. Leon scratched the back of his head. "One too many missions that went sideways," he admitted. "Decided to make a change and see if I could get the boys doing my old job better intel so they didn't end up in the shit shows that I ended up in." Rufus laughed. "Oh, I've been there," he said, shaking his head. "Well, the first part, at any rate. I chose alcoholism instead of the noble path you picked." "Don't worry, there's more than enough alcohol consumption on my end, too," Leon admitted. "Good to know I'm not the only one," Rufus replied, and then startled as the coffee pot hissed and bubbled. Leon raised an eyebrow. "Little jumpy this morning?" he asked. "After spending time in the jungle, I'm always jumpy," Rufus admitted. His companion nodded as the satellite flickered to life. "Been there, brother," he said. "Been there." Rufus pushed away from the desk. "You do what you gotta do," he said, motioning to the computer. "I'll get us coffee. How do you take it?" "I take my coffee like I take my women," Leon said with a wink. "Whatever shows up, I'm diving in." The old man chuckled. "Sounds like me in the 80s, he quipped, and headed for the coffee pot. Leon zoomed in on Van Horn, inspecting the work that the cartel had done the day before. The moonlight was bright enough that the enhanced sensors were able to present a nicely lit image. He couldn't see all the little details like he could if it were daytime, but it was enough to do what he needed. Rufus approached with 2 coffee mugs, sitting down beside Leon and setting them down on the desk. "Gotta be interesting to see if that actually works," he said, leaning forward to get a good look at the screen. "Gotta hope it works better than everything else we've tried," Leon said with a sigh. "Just be sure to hit record on this thing," Rufus joked. "If we do survive this, we can watch it over Christmas drinks and wonder what the hell we were thinking." "I can get behind that," Leon agreed, raising his mug in a cheers before taking a sip of the steaming brew. He took the controls and moved the satellite down the interstate, keeping a mental track of how many miles he was covering. It wasn't an exact science, but it would give him a rough idea of how much time they had. Within seconds, the camera saw the front edge of the horde, still pushing towards Van Horn. "They seem close," Rufus murmured. Leon nodded. 2.5, maybe 3 hours before they reach the bridge, he said. "Oh, good. Fighting them in the dark," Rufus said, eyebrows hitting his hairline. "This should be fun." "Hopefully Rodriguez brings a massive crew," Leon added. The older man shook his head. "With the way this week has gone," he said slowly, "I wouldn't bet on it." Leon continued scrolling down the interstate, zooming out a bit so they can see a mile or so on either side of the road. As they went along, they could see small packs of zombies off the road, no more than a few hundred in each pack. "Well, those radio beacons were a good thought," he said, "but they didn't do much." Rufus sighed and took another sip of coffee. "Ain't no music these days worth listening to, so no big loss on the equipment." "Preaching to the choir on that one," Leon agreed. "If there is one benefit to everything ending, it's the music can't get any worse." Rufus wrinkled his nose. "You say that," he drawled, "but I'm pretty sure I saw Jeff walking around with a harmonica in his pocket." They laughed a bit, and then sobered as they continued to drink their coffee, the weight of the situation rolling back over them. The odds were stacked against them tenfold, and despite all the preparations, it was unlikely they were going to make it through. Before they could make any more small talk, the air horn from the interstate went off, alerting them to an arrival. "That time already, huh?" Rufus asked with a sigh. Leon raised his wrist, checking his watch. 2:30. "Rodriguez is early," he said, furrowing his brow. "This can't be good." They got up and headed outside, coffee cups in hand, and watched as 2 SUVs pulled up to the command center. When they parked, 6 men emerged, including Rodriguez, Javier, and Jose from their previous groups. "So, I'm assuming that the rest of the group is sleeping in?" Leon asked, strain in his tone. Rodriguez shook his head, eyes apologetic. "This is all we have today." "Fucking hell, man!" Rufus exclaimed, throwing up his free hand. "Half a dozen men to hold the line? No way in hell this is happening." Rodriguez raised his palms. "It is out of my hands," he said defensively. "Diago was insistent that I use men to set up his viewing party for tomorrow. I was lucky to even get this group out of the city." "Rufus, you'd better go get some of the others up," Leon said. "We're going to have to send whoever we can to Van Horn." The older man grunted. "I'll get my kit too," he declared. "If I'm going out this early, I might as well blow some shit up." "I have some supplies as well you might find useful," Rodriguez added. Rufus nodded, throwing back the rest of his coffee and handing his empty mug back to Leon before rushing off to gather the crew. "Do you have an update on the situation from the sky?" Rodriguez asked. Leon nodded. "They're a few hours out," he said. "And the radios?" the cartel member asked. Leon sighed. "Minimal success," he reported. "At least they didn't cost any lives," Rodriguez said with a sigh. He raised an eyebrow. "Don't suppose you have an extra cup of coffee, do you?" he asked. Leon held up Rufus's empty cup. "As a matter of fact, I do," he replied. "Come on inside." Rodriguez headed inside, and then put up a hand as Javier followed. "Get the explosive laid out for our friend," he instructed. "He needs to know what we have." Javier paused, and then nodded. "I'll get it done," he said, and then pursed his lips. Rodriguez didn't miss his longing look at Leon's mug. "Don't worry, I'll bring you a cup," he promised with a smirk. Javier smiled and nodded, heading back to the SUV. Leon and Rodriguez headed inside, and as soon as the door clicked shut behind them, the latter spoke in hushed tones. "Listen quick," he said. "Diago is having a viewing party on the bridge due south of City Hall. I need you to study it and pick out where you would set up to protect a target." Leon cocked his head. "You think it's a trap?" he asked. "I know it's a trap," Rodriguez said. "I just don't know where. Our mutual friends need all the information that they can get. Your expertise would be very welcome." Leon nodded. "Next pass I'll make it my top priority," he said, and poured a fresh mug of coffee topping up his own. I appreciate that, Rodriguez said, and upon taking his cup, continued. And I appreciate this. Once we get through this, I'll arrange for a shipment to come your way. Leon smirked. Don't be afraid to send an espresso machine, he joked. I'm pretty sure someone in town can figure it out. Rodriguez laughed. Noted, my friend. Chapter 2. Sparks drove an SUV with Trenton in the passenger seat, Rufus and Jeff in the back. With preparations for the defense of Fabens still in full swing, Clara was left behind to help with that. She followed the two cartel vehicles closely as they sped down the darkened interstate towards Van Horn. While she did, Rufus took notes using a booklight. On one leg he balanced a notebook with a list of explosives, and on the other he had a crudely drawn map of Van Horn. You coming up with anything good, old man? Jeff asked. Rufus shrugged. Depends, he said. Are we absolutely sure we can liquidate this town? Sparks glanced in the rear view at him. Either things go perfectly over the next 48 hours, and we can get supplies from El Paso once Rodriguez is in charge, she piped up. Or we're all going to die. So, yeah, have some fun. Leave it to you, girl, to put a positive spin on the situation, Rufus quipped. She smirked. Well, I did leave out wandering the desert while being pursued by cartel hitmen, she countered. So I thought it was pretty positive. Rufus and Jeff exchanged a glance in agreement that her third suggestion would suck. Well, thanks to our friends up there, Rufus continued, tapping his list. I have a few extra pre-made shrapnel bombs with tripwires. Based on the map that Leon gave me, it looks like there is an exit that runs straight to the north of town. I'm hoping that we have enough time to get there and alleviate some of these, so we can take out a fair number of them when they come off the road. Plus, the noise should bring more our way, too, Jeff added. That's the plan, Rufus agreed. And when that wave hits, we blow the buildings. The skinhead blinked at his friend. Damn, dude, isn't that a bit extreme? Maybe, the old man replied breezily. Maybe not. What I'm sure of, however, is that it's gonna be balls-to-the-wall fun. Trenton twisted in his seat to face them. Plus, the secondary explosion will hopefully pull off more of those things, he added. Don't know how effective it's going to be, but in theory it should relieve some of the pressure on the barricade and give those guys more time to take them down. Jeff sighed. Well, if you ask me, this whole thing is a total waste of our time, he admitted. We already know we're not killing 1,000,000 of these fuckers. All we're doing is slowing them down a bit. I mean, what kind of difference is an hour or two gonna make? Every minute we buy here means another stake in the drainage ditch, Sparks piped up firmly. It means another zombie that will get caught on it. It means another few minutes of safety while the horde marches by on the interstate. We can't blow the humdinger until the horde is past, or else we risk pulling more off of the interstate. That's why we're here. Jeff nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds good, I guess, he admitted. Just as long as I get to crack some heads. Pretty sure that's not going to be an issue today, Trenton murmured. The brake lights on the back of the vehicle in front of them lit up as they approached the bridge, and the convoy stopped about 100 yards from it. What's going on? Jeff asked. Rufus didn't look up from his papers. Looks like you just volunteered to go find out, he drawled. Jeff rolled his eyes and chuckled, opening the door. You got me there, he said. Be right back. He closed the door and headed up to Rodriguez's window, waiting for him to roll it down. There a problem, Chief? He asked. Rodriguez pointed towards the bridge, where 4 zombies spread out across their side of the barricade. They milled about, appearing to have stumbled up from the exit ramp below. Just being extra cautious, Rodriguez admitted. Don't want to risk the vehicles by running them over, and don't want to shoot them for fear that it might attract others. Jeff raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is that all?" he asked, patting the cartel member on the arm. "I got you covered." He headed towards the zombies, and Rodriguez snapped his fingers at Javier. "Go help the man," he instructed, pointing. Javier got out of the vehicle and ran to catch up with Jeff. "I can handle this," the skinhead declared when he realized he had a partner. Javier shrugged. "But I can't handle Rodriguez if I don't listen to him and help you," he said. Jeff tilted his head back and forth, acknowledging the difficult position the lower cartel member was in. "You armed?" he asked, drawing his machete. Javier nodded and pulled out a large knife. "Good," Jeff said with a nod. "Let's make quick work of them. I'll start on the left if you take the right." "I will follow your lead," Javier promised. They picked up their pace, heading towards their respective targets. The echo of their footsteps on the ground attracted the ghouls towards them, making it easy to take them out. Jeff swung hard, catching a ghoul on the side of the head, embedding a blade a good 8 inches into its face. The creature convulsed for a moment before crumpling to the ground. He glanced over at his partner, who delivered a straight jab to the eye of his first ghoul, easily taking it out. Jeff yanked on his machete, but it was embedded too deep. He struggled for a moment before the footsteps and moans of his second target grew too close. "Fuck it," he muttered, and let go of his blade, walking straight up to the zombie. It once had been a middle-aged woman in a now tattered business suit, and he grabbed her by the front of the shirt. The ghoul thrashed about, trying in vain to bite his arm, but it was too far away from its mouth. Jeff grabbed its leg and lifted it up, finishing it with a quick pile-driver onto the pavement. The sound of the corpse's skull cracking echoed in the night air loudly. The skinhead did a quick sweep of the area, seeing no other zombies on the bridge with them as Javier finished his final enemy with a perfect eye strike. He headed over to Jeff, bending to pull the machete wedged in the corpse on the way. He held it out to his companion. "Here, it looks like you lost this," he said. "Appreciate it," Jeff replied, taking his weapon back. As they sheathed their blades, more moans erupted, and they both stiffened. The duo looked around on high alert for the source of the noise, and then realized it was coming from below. So they approached the edge of the bridge. When they looked down, they spotted about a dozen moonlit ghouls milling about. The few streets they could see from their vantage points only showed a few zombies here and there. "Looks like the work we did yesterday paid off," Jeff said. "Not too many of those fuckers." "Good to see it wasn't all for nothing," Javier agreed. The skinhead waved to Rodriguez, letting him know it was clear. He led the trio of vehicles towards them, stopping about 30 yards from the barricade. Everyone got out and walked over, a few of the cartel members picking up the corpses and shuffling them off to the side of the bridge. "Now, don't go throwing those bodies overboard," Jeff said. "We have some visitors down there." The men nodded and laid the corpses against the concrete barrier. Rodriguez checked his watch. "Okay, everyone, listen up," he declared. "We have less than an hour until the horde arrives. Javier, I want your team to start laying out melee weapons along the barricade. 2 at each station, with stations being 5 yards apart. If a weapon gets stuck, leave it and move on. Jose, your team is on rear defense. Deploy the barbed wire across the back bridge supports. I don't expect too many of those things coming up from behind us, but if they do, I don't want them having a free run at us." "And us?" Rufus asked. "You know what you're doing," Rodriguez replied. "Question is, do you need anything from us?" Rufus shrugged. "Just need one of your boys to pull the devices and tripwires, and we'll get out of your hair," he said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Rodriguez let out a quick whistle, and one of his subordinates approached quickly. "Get this man what he needs from the back of my vehicle," he instructed. The cartel member nodded and led Rufus off to the SUV to retrieve the explosives. "Once we get everything set up, we'll be sending Jeff and Trenton back to help with the barricade defense," Sparks said. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Why only those 2? He asked. "Because we're doing multiple detonations," she explained. so we have to physically be there to light the fuse. He nodded. Understood, he replied. Believe me when I say that we aren't going to be staying there any longer than absolutely necessary, she said, raising a hand. We'll be back on the line before you know it, and hopefully not dragging any of those things along with us. Rufus returned with a large duffel bag of gear slung over his shoulder. I'm ready when y'all are, he announced. Be safe, friends, Rodriguez said, and the four of them nodded in response before heading back towards the on-ramp that led down to the town below. Sparks, Trenton, and Jeff readied their blades for battle. Got nearly a dozen or so at the bottom of the ramp, Jeff said. We'll be ready for them, Sparks replied firmly. They walked down the ramp, watching out for the ghouls milling about. Rufus hung back as the three others stepped forward and unleashed their fury on the hapless zombies. Jeff approached a group of three, kicking the leader into the others and sending them all to the ground. He followed that up with several powerful hacks to their heads. Sparks was a little more agile in her attacks, darting around outstretched hands and delivering knife strikes to the side and backs of their heads. Trenton was straightforward, walking up to the first creature and slamming his machete straight down on top of its head before doing the same to the ones behind it. Within a few moments, the street in front of them was clear. However, being in the shadow of the bridge, it made it difficult to see very far, or at least clearly. We should move up a block before heading to the other side of town, Sparks suggested. Trenton nodded. Agreed, he replied. Not a fan of being this close to the underpass. Aw, are you afraid of the dark? Jeff teased playfully. Trenton smirked. Yes, I am, he declared. I know for a fact monsters are hiding in it. Jeff laughed and shook his head. Fair enough, he replied. Next block up it is then. The group reached the next intersection, staying on guard and staring into the void that was the darkened underpass. They paused at every noise, waiting to make sure they weren't about to be ambushed by ghouls. When they reached the intersection, they spotted a clear path to the next block. They surveyed the street, filled with small homes, to make sure it was clear. As they walked up, they looked at the houses, seeing they were cheap and run down. Man, you would have had to pay me to live in a shithole like this place, Jeff muttered. Funny, you don't strike me as someone who had a particularly high standard of living before the apocalypse, Trenton said, raising an eyebrow. What did you live in before all this? A moderately new double-wide, Jeff announced. The younger man cocked his head. And you're criticizing people with real homes? Yeah, because at least my shithole of a home was near civilization, the skinhead replied, rolling his eyes. I could be in downtown Austin in 45 minutes. Or 6 hours, depending on traffic, Sparks piped up. Jeff chuckled. Ain't that the damn truth? He burst out laughing suddenly, holding his gut, and the others side-glanced him in confusion. You okay there? Sparks asked slowly. Yeah, sorry, he gasped as he struggled to contain his mirth. I just envisioned some poor slob sitting on the interstate on his way to his office job, still sitting in traffic on the I-35, completely oblivious to the zombies, and just thinking traffic is really, really bad. He chuckled again, shaking his head. Trenton blinked at him. Come on. Traffic in Austin couldn't have been that bad, he argued. It was, Jeff and Sparks said in unison, which made all four of the group laugh. Glad I picked UTEP over UT then, Trenton said with a sigh. They reached the next block, looking to the east towards the far end of town. There was a small smattering of zombies milling about, none of them within 10 yards of each other. They continued walking and chatting, only occasionally pausing to lop the head off of a wayward ghoul. At this point, the zombies were less of a threat and more of a nuisance. You think any other survivor groups out there have had it as bad as we do? Trenton asked. Jeff rolled his eyes. We're trapped between a murderous drug cartel and the Million Zombie March, he retorted. Pretty sure we're top 5 for shittiest position to be in. Could be worse, Rufus drawled. "At least we aren't in a big city." "What are you talking about?" Jeff asked, raising his eyebrows. "We got through Austin okay, didn't we?" The older man shook his head. "No. We got through an area close to Austin, and barely did that," he corrected. "Think about what those poor bastards are dealing with in New York City, or Chicago, or Los Angeles. Those fuckers never had a chance." "You think there are survivors left in those cities?" Trenton asked. "You'd be amazed at what people can survive," Rufus replied with a sigh. "There were people who were within half a mile of the bomb at Hiroshima that survived, and lived into their 90s. Not many, mind you, but some did. There's not a doubt in my mind that there are some scavengers roaming around New York City right now looking for food." Trenton shrugged. "Hell, at least we can go outside and walk around," he admitted. "Maybe we don't have it so bad." "Jeff," Sparks cut in, pointing to a couple of creatures stumbling out from around the side of a house. The skinhead didn't speak, simply nodded and headed over to deal with them. With 2 quick hacks they were down for the count. He casually walked back over to the group, rejoining them to continue to the other side of town. "Well, if the next few days go well, our entire situation will improve dramatically," he said. When they reached their destination, they paused and looked both ways. There were a handful of zombies to the north, moving away towards the faint sounds of music they'd set up the day prior. Everything between them and the interstate was clear. On either side of the street stood small buildings, some businesses and some warehouse space. They were all single-story, with glass front windows. "First things first, though," Rufus declared. "We gotta blow some shit up." "Jeff, Trenton, do a sweep of the stores," Sparks instructed. "Make sure nothing is going to come out and surprise us. Rufus, let's start picking your spots." There was a chorus of, "Yes, ma'am," and everyone got to work. Sparks glanced at her watch. Only 25 minutes before the horde reached them. She took a deep breath to center herself, and then joined the others. Chapter 3. Sparks stood at the base of a building as Rufus looked down at her, struggling to get a good view in the dim moonlight. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Toss it." Rufus gently tossed down a thin metal wire with a device attached to it. She cradle-caught it and quickly ran across the street, leaving a trail of wire behind her. The device was positioned near the middle of the street, a large 2-liter bottle filled with shrapnel. Sparks took care to make sure that the pin didn't strike the ground. When she reached the building across the street, she looked up at Jeff on the roof. "Here it comes!" she called, and tossed up the wire. The skinhead grabbed it and pulled it up to the roof, stretching it out and securing it to a metal pipe before running back to the edge. "We're looking good here," he reported. Sparks nodded and looked down the street. They'd set up half a dozen of the devices stretching over 2 blocks. 1 block up, Trenton stood at the top of a ladder, carefully running a tripwire through the pin on a device, making sure there was plenty of slack on both sides so it didn't accidentally pull out. Once through, he climbed down and headed to the next one. As he did so, Rufus and Jeff returned to street level. "How we doing on time?" Rufus asked. Sparks checked her watch. "Not good," she admitted. "They'll be here any minute." "I'd like to be able to rig these buildings before they get here," the old man replied. "You start getting prepped," Jeff suggested. "I'm going to do a visual check." "Be safe," Sparks said. Rufus nodded. "And quick," he added. The couple ran down the street to the furthest building from the interstate to start setting up the storefront bombs. "What are we doing when we get in here?" Sparks asked. Rufus grinned. "These redneck rattlers will pack a solid punch, but if you find anything that looks like it'll shatter real nice, get it," he instructed. "A little extra shrapnel never hurt anybody." She raised an amused eyebrow, and he waved a hand at her. "Anybody that was on our side of the bomb anyway," he added. When they reached the door of a small convenience store, they paused. "You work on the bomb," Spark said. "I'll clear the place, and then look for shrapnel." Rufus nodded before she burst through the front door. She immediately rushed around, looking down every aisle for threats. As she went, there was movement behind the counter. "Potential contact. Counter," she declared. Rufus paused and turned, raising his knife in a defensive position. Sparks readied her own blade and crept towards the counter. She darted through the opening, looking down on the floor for a fallen zombie. She let out a sigh of relief when she saw it was only a raccoon. She clapped her hands and let out a sharp whistle to get the tiny creature to run along. It scurried away, slipping out the back of the building. Rufus smirked. "Just for the record, when we're not in immediate danger," he drawled. "I know how to fry those suckers up good." Spark smiled. "That is good to know," she replied. She tensed at the sound of knocking in the back room and raised her knife again. "You start setting up. I'll clear it." "I can help," Rufus offered. She shook her head. "I can handle it," she assured him. She readied her knife and flashlight, moving towards the back room as he went back to work setting up the next explosive. "If it's that raccoon, I swear I'm making a Davy Crockett hat out of it," she muttered. The knocking intensified, coupled with low moaning. Sparks took a deep breath and came around the corner. The storeroom had several boxes of goods stacked up along the walls, and the back door was open. The raccoon ran around the floor, dodging the flailing arms of a clumsy zombie that wasn't quite fast enough to grab it. Spark stayed in the shadows, waiting for the ghoul to turn its back on her. As soon as it did, she rushed forward and kicked it in the ass, sending it tumbling forward onto the ground. She jammed her blade into the back of its skull as the coon retreated into a corner, little eyes round as saucers. "You better leave while you have the chance, little buddy," Spark said, and got back to her feet, heading to the back door. She peered out to see if there was any more trouble. The driveway was clear in both directions. Sparks looked at the raccoon and gave a few pss-pss sounds, coaxing the animal out of the building. Once it was out, she shut the door behind it. "We're clear back here," she called to Rufus. Meanwhile, Jeff worked his way up to the top of the exit ramp. As he approached the threshold, he could see down the moonlit interstate, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Less than a quarter-mile away was the front edge of the horde, shuffling towards him. He ducked down, staying out of sight as much as he could, knowing that if one glimpsed him, that they could potentially speed up. They needed every second. "Fucking hell," he murmured under his breath. "Not gonna be long now." He stared into the horde for another moment before taking a deep breath and turning tail, running back towards his team. "We have 5 minutes max," he called. Trenton fed a tripwire through the second-to-last bomb's pin. "Help me then," he instructed. "Steady this ladder." Jeff rushed over and held onto the ladder so that Trenton could slide down it quickly. Once he was down, the skinhead grabbed it and ran it over to the final elevated device, standing at the bottom to hold it steady so Trenton could scramble to the top. Sparks and Rufus emerged from the second building, and Jeff waved at them. 5 minutes, max, he yelled. Rufus sighed. "Damn it. We don't have time to set the rest of these up," he said with a sigh. "What about one big blast?" Sparks asked. He shook his head. "The extra firepower ain't gonna take that many more out," he explained. "But will it be louder?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Rufus nodded. "Yeah, should be," he replied. "Then that's all we care about," Sparks said, patting him on the shoulder. "We just want to pull them off of the interstate. Killing them was just an added bonus in the second round." The older man shrugged. "Big blast it is, then," he declared. They ran to the corner building, not bothering to go inside and instead setting up the devices on the outer edge, so it covered the most ground. As Rufus worked on the small explosives, Sparks took out her knife and punched a small hole into the front window so that he could feed the fuse through it. She approached the front door with her flashlight, busting in to clear the building. It was a small boutique clothing store, and during her quick sweep she was relieved that there was no movement at all. "We're clear in here," she said as she emerged back into the street. "Good," Rufus replied, and held out the fuse. "Take this and run it inside," he instructed. "Give it about a 4-minute fuse." She raised an eyebrow. "How do I determine that?" she asked. "About 30 seconds a foot," he said. Sparks nodded and fed it through the window, running back in through the front door to pull through the proper length. Once she had it secure, she ran back outside. "Jeff, go pop off a few rounds and then hurry back here," she called. "We need to pull as many of those things this way as possible." "Where are we meeting?" the skinhead asked. "Last store on this block," Sparks said. "That way we can see them hit the tripwire." Jeff nodded and rushed back towards the interstate as Trenton hit the ground. The younger man joined them as Rufus got to his feet. "Trenton, get to the building and start moving the metal display racks to the front window so that we have some added protection," Sparks instructed. "I'll be there in a minute." The kid nodded and raced off. Rufus furrowed his brow and turned to her. "You want to tell me why we aren't all running there now?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "Because I want you to head back to the bridge," she said firmly. "Girl, I ain't leaving you," he countered immediately. "How many rattlers do you have left?" she asked. He pursed his lips. 4 or 5, he replied. "They're going to need them on the bridge to thin them out," she said. Rufus ran a hand through his hair and nodded begrudgingly. "All right, I'll head back," he agreed. "You know what to do here, right?" "Yep. Take cover on the first blast," she replied with a reassuring smile. "Then wait until they're all filled up again before lighting the next fuse. Once we do that, we run like hell." He nodded and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him. "Now, you don't take too long," he said, voice thick as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "Or else I'm gonna come looking for you, girl." Sparks smiled affectionately at him and kissed him softly before giving him a hug. They parted, sharing one last smile before heading in their respective directions. "Come get some, motherfuckers!" Jeff bellowed from the base of the exit ramp. There was a huge moving mass on the bridge above, with only a few stragglers heading down towards him. He aimed and began firing rapidly. He couldn't see where his shots were hitting, but it didn't really matter all that much. A few moments later, the few zombies became a stream of ghouls heading his way. "Yeah, that's right," he yelled. "Come and fucking get me!" He finished the rest of his magazine before reloading. As he stood there, waiting for the ghouls to come towards him, he jumped at the sound of a wet smack behind him. He whipped around. "What the hell?" he breathed, laying his eyes on a smushed zombie, flattened on the pavement. A second later, 2 more fell from the bridge, splattering on the road. He looked up, surprised at the amount of ghouls reaching over the side of the bridge to try to get to him. "Skydiving zombies?" he muttered, shaking his head. "What's next?" He aimed up and fired a couple of times, which enraged the ghouls at the edge even more, sending them flopping over. He watched with amusement as they splattered on impact. "I think I found a new favorite pastime," he said brightly, and watched a few more crash to the ground before checking the exit ramp. He gave the ghouls a wave and then turned to head to the rendezvous point. As he jogged up the street, he watched the front end of the breakaway group get to the bottom of the exit ramp. He was relieved to see a thick pack of ghouls following the leaders. As he reached the store, Sparks appeared in the doorway, waving him in. He ducked inside and she closed the door behind him, securing it. "Looks like you drew a crowd," she said, appraising his handiwork through the window. "And had some high divers from the bridge," the skinhead replied with a grin. "I swear, if we are ever bored, we should round up a few of them and have our own zombie Olympics. Judge them on their diving form and whatnot." Trenton snorted. "We really need to find you a hobby," he said. "What in the hell would you call zombie diving, then?" Jeff shot back. Trenton raised an eyebrow. "Signs of mental illness?" he asked. Sparks guffawed and patted the skinhead on the shoulder. "Well, if you're a good boy, Santa might set that up for your Christmas gift," she said gently. "Shit, I gotta be good," Jeff scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh well, it was a fun thought." They shared a chuckle and then settled in behind the barricaded window, hiding behind the metal display racks for protection. They looked through the gaps towards the far end of the road, watching the ghouls shuffle towards them. "Hard to believe that this is just a tiny fraction of what is on the interstate," Trenton murmured. Jeff took a deep breath. "Trust me, you start believing it real quick when that horde is staring you in the face," he said. "Oh, I know. Already done it," Trenton replied. "Not exactly looking forward to doing it again." "Well, enjoy the next 20 minutes of peace, then," Jeff quipped. Sparks shushed them as the ghouls grew closer, reaching the edge of the block. While she knew it was unlikely that a little talking would draw the zombies in their direction, she didn't want to take the chance. The group tensed a bit as the first ghouls became parallel to the store, most of them looking worse for wear. The bodies had been severely damaged by exposure at the constant desert winds pelting them with dust. Even though they'd fought several groups of corpses for the past few days, this was the first time they'd gotten a sustained look at them from safety, giving them time to really scrutinize the enemy. My God, if those bodies are able to withstand that much damage and still keep moving, Sparks thought, eyes widening, these things are going to be with us forever. She took a deep breath and shook the dark thoughts away, staying focused on the situation at hand. The group watched as the ghouls wandered past the window, filling the street from building to building. "The tripwire is about 10 yards up from where they are," Sparks whispered. "Be ready." The boys gave her a thumbs up, and the three braced for violent detonation. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the zombies finally reached the wire. The explosion was deafening, sending a small shockwave through the street in rapid succession as the wire pulled the pins from each device. Shrapnel scattered, piercing the skulls and torsos of numerous corpses, not to mention the glass storefronts lining the street. Thankfully, the window they hid behind didn't completely shatter, though cracks spiderwebbed across it. Sparks stood up, a little woozy from the force of the blast, which had been much larger than she'd anticipated. She was relieved to see the front window still held together, but less so at the result of the bombs. Only about 70% of the zombies in the street had been eliminated, or at least knocked down. It was difficult to tell in the dim light, but it appeared to her as though several of the ones on the ground still flailed around, struggling to get up. She lingered a little too long, and then a couple of the ghouls took notice of her, turning and moaning, wandering towards her instead of to the north. "Fuck," she muttered, and ducked quickly. "What?" Jeff hissed. "They saw me," she whispered. "Stay quiet." The boys nodded, and they all stayed stock still, barely even breathing. After a few tense moments, something smacked on the glass, a familiar sound that the trio knew to be zombie hands. A moment later, more hands joined in, and then more, and more. "That glass is damaged pretty bad," Sparks said quietly. "It's not going to last much longer." "Then let's light these things and get the fuck out of Dodge," Jeff hissed. Sparks shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "We have to wait until the last possible moment to light it." He didn't seem exactly enthused with that answer, but nodded. They only had one chance, and they had to make it count. The group continued lying low, listening to the growing chorus of moans and smacking on the glass. Their hearts jumped a beat when the glass finally began to crack under the weight of the zombies. After several moments of this, the cracking escalated to the sound of glass cascading to the floor. The trio lunged forward, putting their weight against the metal shelving to hold the enemy in place. The sound of falling glass alerted even more ghouls from outside. Spark stood on tiptoes to look over the shelves, and saw a few dozen more corpses headed their way. "Trenton, light it up!" she cried, and he broke away from them. Jeff shoved in to try to hold the display from two positions as the younger man ran to the corner to find the fuse and light it. "We're lit!" he called back. "Out the back, now!" Sparks yelled, and they broke away from the shelves at the same time, tearing for the back of the store. As soon as they let go, the metal slid across the floor under the weight of the horde outside. The trio didn't spend any time watching them as they rushed to the back. They ran through the back room to the exit, pausing very briefly at the back door, Sparks in the lead. "Trenton, you light the next building and I'll handle the corner," she said quickly. "Jeff, you cover our escape." The men nodded in unison, and she threw open the door. They raced outside into the alley behind the buildings, which was still clear. They pumped their legs hard towards the bridge, Trenton breaking off into the first building and Sparks ducking into the second one. Jeff pulled out his machete, readying himself for anything that might come around the corner. Sparks tore through the small store, moving to the southern wall to remain out of sight. When she reached the front where the fuse was, she pulled out her lighter, but then paused. She peeked around the corner towards the bridge. She was relieved to see a fresh batch of ghouls coming off of the interstate, attracted by the explosions. The new horde seemed to be having issues navigating the roadway that was now filled with freshly killed corpses, stumbling and tripping and falling all over themselves. "Damn it," she muttered to herself. "They aren't going to get up here in time for the explosion." She shook her head and lit the fuse. "Guess we'll have to settle for more breaking away." She tore out the back of the store to meet up with the others. When she emerged into the alleyway, the two men were smacking down zombies coming down the side street. There were only a handful, maybe a half dozen, but it was enough to keep them busy. Sparks rushed forward, landing with a powerful front kick, sending one ghoul into several others. "We hold this line for 45 seconds, then run like hell," she declared. The trio hacked and slashed at the coming zombies that were quickly growing from 6 to a few dozen, attracted by the noise. Sparks continued to fight, the main thought running through her head. "God, I hope I put 2 full minutes on that fuse." She shoved her worries aside and went into full countdown mode. With every strike, her mind was focused on the seconds. 28, 27... A tightly grouped batch of ghouls came up the street, maybe 8 or so, almost set up like bowling pins. 19, 18... Sparks broke the line and ran directly at the group. She picked up a head of steam before leaping into the air, planting her foot directly in the chest of the front zombie and sending the entire group falling backwards. She quickly pulled out her handgun and opened fire at the nearby ghouls that she ran by to reach the pack. 9, 8... She fired off a few more shots before retreating at full speed. When she reached her companions, she opened her mouth. "Run! Run! Run!" she screamed. The men turned just as she blew past them and took off like a shot, pumping their legs hard to get up the side street. They barely got half a block up when the first bomb went off. The trio didn't stop running until they reached the end of the second block. When they did stop, Sparks did a quick sweep of the area to make sure they were alone. As she did this, the bomb that Trenton lit detonated, sending a fireball into the night sky. Sparks looked back towards the stores, watching as a growing number of ghouls headed their way up the road, some of them almost at the back end of the store. "Come on, come on," Sparks murmured to herself. She didn't have to wait long for the giant stockpile of redneck rattlers to detonate. The fireball not only reached high into the heavens, but also completely engulfed everything on that block in hellfire. "Woo!" Jeff bellowed, throwing his arms into the air. "Burn, motherfuckers, burn!" He and Trenton exchanged a high five as Sparks stared intently at the fire, hoping that the flames were enough to quell the threat. As it began to die down, her hope was rewarded with no zombies headed their way. They were in enough of a shadow that the ghouls currently walking down the main street to the north couldn't see them. "That went a lot better than I expected it to," Trenton admitted. Jeff raised an eyebrow. "Shit. Is it my turn to be the optimist today?" he asked. As if on cue, a redneck rattler went off on the bridge, and they watched the resulting fireball light up the zombie-packed area. "I think we can shelve that idea entirely for the rest of the morning," Sparks said. They stared up at the scene in stunned silence for a moment, and then finally the redhead sighed. "Come on," she said. "Let's get up there." The trio took off towards the bridge, hoping that the men on the line were able to hold it. Chapter 4. The scene on the bridge was chaotic, with a full line of zombies pressed up against the metallic barricade. All of them moaned and reached out for the fresh prey that was on the other side. Rodriguez stood in the center, right at the point of the V-shape, delivering several strikes to the top of a zombie's head with a lead pipe. As soon as it slumped over, he turned and cupped a hand around his mouth. "Keep hitting them hard," he bellowed. "We have to stop them from pushing." He went back to bashing as the other men on the line delivered strikes of their own, using a mixture of blunt objects and bladed weapons. Zombies fought to get over the waist-high metal structure, and the men defended with all they had. On the outer edges of the bridge, several ghouls lost their balance, tumbling over the side when their brethren pushed from behind them. Corpses landed hard on the pavement below, liquefying their fragile skulls and ending the threat. Javier stood on the north side of the bridge, close to the edge, hacking away with his machete before glancing over the side at the dozens of zombies plummeting to the ground. Distracted by the sight, he startled as a rotted hand grabbed his arm. He reacted quickly, bringing his machete down on the ghoul's elbow joint, snapping it clean off. He quickly spiked the creature in the face with the blade before grabbing the limb and tossing it over the side. Rodriguez continued the good fight in the middle of things, and then paused at light creaking in the metal barricade. "It can't start buckling yet," he breathed in disbelief. He glanced back at Rufus, who was ducking underneath the wire at the back and rushing towards him. "Do you have explosives?" he yelled. The older man nodded. "Where do you need them?" he asked. "We need to relieve pressure on the center joint," Rodriguez replied, motioning to the barricade. Rufus rummaged around in his canvas bag. "Not a problem," he said, and pulled out a redneck rattler. He lit it up and gave it a solid toss straight ahead, landing it about 15 yards deep into the horde. "Fire in the hole!" he bellowed. The men all braced themselves, and a few moments later the rattler detonated, sending flames into the sky as well as obliterating the zombies around it. This created a nice pocket within the horde and relieved the pressure on the center of the barricade. The force of the blast also sent a few dozen ghouls tumbling over the edges of the bridge. "How many more do you have?" Rodriguez asked. Rufus rummaged around again, doing a quick count. "I got 4, he replied. Rodriguez nodded. "You stay close to me. I'll let you know when to throw another," he instructed. "I'll be ready," Rufus replied. On the south side of the bridge, Domingo fought using a piece of rebar as a makeshift spear. He lined up his shot and lunged forward, stabbing a ghoul in the eye before doing it again. His aim wasn't always accurate, with the tip of the metal ending up in a forehead, but he was strong enough to be able to punch through the skull since it was weakened with decay. As he lined up another shot, one of the men to his left started yelling, drawing his attention. He looked over and saw that a zombie had gotten a hold of him, and the man was panicking. Domingo broke away from his post and ran over, delivering a vicious strike to the side of the attacking corpse's head. His companion thrashed and then finally broke free from the death grip, giving Domingo a jerky nod of thanks. As he went back to his post, he saw a zombie had managed to tumble over the side. The creature fell on top of a dead corpse that had been pushed over by the horde, and Domingo rushed forward, aiming his weapon at the ghoul's chest, planting it hard. His momentum forced it back, slamming it into the side of the bridge. He ducked down, grabbing its legs and flipping it over the side, taking the weapon with it. "Damn it," he muttered, and darted back to the barricade, bending down to grab another chunk of rebar before resuming his onslaught. Rufus stood back, watching the half-dozen men wage constant battle on the ghouls. No matter how many zombies they struck down, more appeared, and soon there were so many dead bodies on the front line that the weight of the ones behind them crushed the unmoving ones, cutting them in two. Within minutes there was a grotesque collection of torsos on the living side of the line. "Rufus! Bomb!" Rodriguez bellowed. The old man snapped back to his task, lighting another bomb and tossing it into the crowd. A few moments later, the fireball illuminated the area, revealing that they had barely done any damage. As the flames subsided, the sun peeked over the horizon, fully showing how much trouble they were really in. Rufus stood on his tiptoes, looking back down the interstate and seeing that it was completely full of zombies, stretching as far as he could see. From his vantage point, it was difficult to see the exit ramp where they set the traps, but it appeared as though there were several zombies moving off. Not that this did them much good up front. Javier continued to battle the horde, hacking and slashing away at the ghouls. He glanced over to a beast of a cartel member beside him that was doing work with a sledgehammer, swinging it like a baseball bat and dislodging several heads with each arc. He worked his way up and down the line, delivering strike after strike after strike. As this was happening, Javier froze at the sound of creaking metal in front of him. He looked down and realized that the end of the barricade was beginning to buckle ever so slightly under the weight. Rather than panic, an idea popped into his head, and he let out a sharp whistle to get the attention of the sledgehammer-wielding giant. "Get over here, quick!" Javier cried. The man didn't hesitate, running along the line to him and standing at attention. "We need to relieve pressure on this," Javier said, pointing to the barricade. "Can you push these things towards the edge?" The man smiled and nodded, understanding exactly what he needed to do. He turned and used the sledgehammer as a battering ram, putting it in the chest of a ghoul and shoving as hard as he could. The force of the push sent those nearest to the edge tumbling over, like a quarter push game at a casino. "It's working!" Javier cried excitedly. The giant continued shoving the zombies and creating a constant stream of corpses falling to their doom below. As he did this, Javier continued to crack skulls. Their combined effort relieved the pressure on the barricade and stopped the creaking. As this happened, Sparks, Trenton, and Jeff came up the side street a block away from the bridge. They stopped in the middle of the road, watching as the stream of corpses fell off of the bridge and slammed into the ground. "See, I told you zombie diving was awesome," Jeff declared. Trenton laughed. "Hard to argue that," he admitted. Another huge explosion went off on the bridge, sending a fresh fireball into the air and rotted body parts raining down onto the street below. "Come on, we gotta get up there," Sparks urged, and took off at a run. She led the trio to the on-ramp, making sure to stick to the side of the road to avoid being crushed by the raining ghouls from above. By the time they reached the ramp, they noticed that the zombies smacking into the ground weren't hitting with as much of a thud as they'd been earlier. They paused briefly to look over, noticing that the freshly flying zombies were landing on the corpses of their brethren, while it was still enough to take the majority of them out. Some continued to writhe and move after impact. "Fuck! They're cushioning the fall," Jeff muttered. Sparks shook her head. "That's going to be an issue soon," she said. "Come on." She sprinted up the ramp, the others close behind, as some of the fallen ghouls managed to get to their feet under the bridge, surviving the fall. "Rufus!" Sparks cried as she ducked under the barbed wire barrier.
"There you are, girl,"
he said, whirling around with relief in his eyes. "I was starting to get worried."
"Where is Rodriguez?"
she asked immediately. He pointed to the center of the V-shaped barricade where Rodriguez continued to bash in heads.
"Jeff, relieve him,"
Sparks declared, motioning to the cartel member. The skinhead nodded and ran up, bellowing, "Rodriguez, switch out!" He took a step back and looked over his shoulder, spotting Sparks and company having arrived. He casually tossed his large metal pipe to Jeff, who immediately took his spot, bashing in heads. "Glad you returned safely," Rodriguez said as he approached Sparks.
"What's the status up here?"
she asked. He shook his head. "We're holding on, but barely," he admitted. "The barricade is starting to buckle at the top, but we're relieving some pressure on the sides by shoving those things off. With you here, we might be able to push more."
"That's a temporary solution," she replied, "because some of them are surviving the fall by landing on the others."
His brow furrowed in concern. "How many?" he asked, shoulders slumping in defeat.
"Only a handful right now," Sparks replied. "But the more we push over, the bigger the cushion they have."
"I fear as though we don't have much of a choice," Rodriguez said, spreading his arms. "Without relieving the pressure, this barricade is going to collapse."
Sparks pursed her lips for a moment in thought, and then raised an eyebrow. "Do we have any more of those radio setups?"
"Yes. Should still be a couple in my vehicle," he replied, nodding. "Why?"
"There's a house just across the street from the bridge," Sparks explained, jerking a thumb over her shoulder. "I'm going to set that thing up and pull some of those things off."
Rodriguez nodded and motioned to the vehicle. "Should be in the back seat," he said. She turned to head off, but Rufus caught her arm, eyes concerned.
"You're not doing anything stupid now, are you, girl?"
he asked.
She smiled at him. "It's only stupid if it doesn't work," she joked.
"What do you need me to do?"
he asked firmly.
"When you're done being a bomber, I need you to grab an assault rifle," she explained. "I'm going to need cover coming back up that ramp."
"I'll clear the road for you,"
Rufus promised. Sparks turned towards the line.
"Jeff, Trenton," she yelled. "Stay up here and do whatever Rodriguez needs you to do. I'll be back."
Both men called back, "Yes, ma'am." Sparks raced off to the SUV with Rufus in tow. She threw it open and they dug around, the redhead finding the radio equipment and dragging it out. Rufus grabbed a couple of scoped AR-15s, along with a small bag filled with several full magazines.
"You going to be firing both of those things at once?"
Sparks asked, raising an eyebrow. He shook his head.
"Nope,"
he replied.
"But I figure you're going to want to get in on the fun once you get back."
"Good call," she agreed with a nod. "You have any explosives yet?"
He grinned.
"Saved one just for you," Rufus replied. "Buying that barricade a few extra minutes ain't worth risking you, girl."
"You're too good to me," she said with a warm smile. He winked at her.
"Don't sell yourself short," he said. "You're worth it."
They stepped away from the SUV, slamming the trunk shut before rushing over to the top of the on-ramp. They looked down at the dozen or so zombies spread out over the bottom half, slowly working their way up.
"Which way you want to go?"
Rufus asked. She inclined her head.
"Going down the left side," she said. "Barring some major gathering, I'm coming back that way too."
He readied his rifle, aiming downrange. The rising sun illuminated the area, and despite being low in the sky, it wasn't shining in his eyes. He aimed carefully, picking out the closest corpse and squeezing the trigger. The zombie's head exploded, and the body dropped to the ground.
"I'll hold down the fort," he declared. "Just don't be too long."
Sparks nodded and took off like a shot, darting to the left side of the on-ramp. She pumped her legs hard, bullets whizzing from behind her. A couple of the zombies to her right, still about 5 yards away, but headed towards her, dropped as shots ripped through their skulls. She moved farther to the left as she reached the bottom of the ramp, bodies hitting the ground rapidly, more than a few every second. Most landed on other bodies, but some hit fresh concrete and splattered spectacularly. She raced towards a house a block up, the closest one to her. As she approached, a few zombies came out from the side, attracted to the noise. She didn't waste time pulling out her handgun and opening fire.
In a matter of seconds, they'd all dropped. She raced up to the wooden front door, trying the handle but finding it locked. She backed up without hesitation, aiming her gun at the locking mechanism and opening fire. 3 bullets did the trick, freeing the door from the frame. She kicked it in and burst inside, doing a quick sweep of the living room. While there were no zombies, the scene inside was one of carnage, with overturned furniture and long-dried blood splattered everywhere. "Fuck," she muttered. With a scene like this and a locked door, there was a good chance she wasn't alone. She also knew that time was short, so she raced through the house rather than being cautious. "Hey, come on out!" she bellowed as she ran and ducked into the kitchen. There was no movement in there, but she heard shuffling from the back bedroom. Sparks found the hallway, spotting a lumbering corpse at the back. She quickly fired as she advanced, waiting for more to come out. As the first collapsed, another zombie staggered out of the bedroom door, and she put it down efficiently with a bullet to the forehead. She paused, letting out a loud whistle before falling quiet and straining her ears. There wasn't any more noise, so she booked it back to the living room. When she reached it, she spotted a few zombies shuffling across the front yard towards the house, and she took them down with well-placed bullets before slamming the front door. Rather than open the windows, she picked up a small table beside the recliner and used the legs to smash the glass. Once it was out of the way, she put the table down in front of the gaping window and started setting up the audio equipment. Just as she finished setting the speakers up, she spotted several ghouls in the front yard coming her way. She quickly left the equipment and grabbed the recliner, dragging it over and pressing it against the busted front door. "Not going to buy me a lot of time," she thought as she rushed back to the audio equipment. "But hopefully, I don't need that much." Meanwhile, the situation on the bridge was becoming more intense. With no more explosives to thin the herd, the pressure on the beams increased. Rodriguez stood by Jeff as the two of them wailed on the ghouls in front of them. In between the cracking of skulls, they could hear the unmistakable sound of metal creaking and giving way. Jeff glanced over at the giant cartel member using his hammer to shove more zombies over the edge of the bridge. "Why aren't we doing that?" he exclaimed. "Not going to do much good to push back from here, is it?" Rodriguez replied. "If we push them sideways it might," the skinhead countered. "Gets them off the line and over the edge." The sound of metal deteriorating intensified, forcing Rodriguez to adapt to the unorthodox plan from his unlikely partner. He looked over at the sledgehammer-wielding cartel member and let out a whistle, motioning for him to come over. "Yes, boss?" the man asked. "We're pushing from the center point here, towards the edge," Rodriguez explained, motioning. The beastly man looked from the center to the edge of the bridge, his eyes raking over the approximate 20 yards. Despite his reservations, he didn't question it. "Where do you want me?" he asked. Rodriguez motioned to his left, and Jeff took up position to his right. The three of them used the blunt ends of their respective weapons and pressed against corpse chests. "Push!" Rodriguez yelled, and the trio shoved with everything they had, straining to move the large crowd even a little. After several moments, they began to move a bit along the line. Finally, one of the creatures tilted back enough that it was forced to take a full step back. When it did, this set off a chain reaction that rippled through the crowd, sending zombies over the edge of the bridge. "It's working!" Javier cried and joined in from his position near the edge. He moved about 5 yards away, shoving the line of ghouls along, which in turn made the trio in the center's job easier. Soon they'd pushed as far as they could, their knees hitting the barricade. Several arms from the sides reached out, attempting to grab them, and the trio instinctively leapt backwards. "Wait until they are back up and do it again," Rodriguez instructed. Both Jeff and the cartel member let out grunts in response, too tired to muster proper words. At least it got their point across. Suddenly, Domingo's voice erupted from the south side of the bridge. "Breach!" he screamed. "Breach!" The trio turned and saw that the section of barricade from the middle of the right flank had bent to the point of a small opening. Zombies wedged their way in and began to pop out on the living side. Without instruction, both Jeff and the beastly cartel member rushed over. Domingo was attempting to beat back the horde, but he wasn't terribly effective at it.
"Move!"
the large cartel member demanded, and Domingo immediately retreated, shoving the zombie he'd been fighting. The ghoul stumbled a bit, but remained standing, at least until a sledgehammer smashed it in the head and flipped it over backwards. Jeff rushed up to the hole, swinging his pipe wildly. 3 zombies shoved through the small, jagged opening, leaving chunks of flesh in the metal as they pressed in. The skinhead brained the first one, dropping it to the ground. Before he could swing at it, the sledgehammer came flying in, nearly exploding the ghoul head it hit.
"I'll hold them back," the beastly cartel member instructed. "You pack the hole with them."
Jeff nodded, catching what he was implying. The behemoth pushed hard, shoving the ghouls back a bit, and the skinhead went to work, grabbing corpses and shoving them into the hole. While it wasn't a perfect solution, it would buy them a little time. As he continued to shove bodies in, loud music blasted from the north. "Sparks! Thank God!" Jeff breathed, letting out a sigh of relief. Sparks put the finishing touches on the music, cranking the volume up as loud as it would go. "Good as it's going to get," she muttered, and looked out the front window towards the door. She'd drawn quite a crowd, at least 15 to 20 ghouls moshing around. She reloaded her gun as she got ready to make a run for it. "Back door it is then," she said, and darted to the back of the house. The recliner blocking the door screeched across the tiles under the weight of the zombies, and she pressed herself against the wall next to the back door. She peered out to survey the area, seeing 6 creatures in the immediate area between her house and the next, but none closer than 10 yards to her. She burst through the back door, taking aim and shooting the closest ghoul to pave her way, and then took off through the backyards. She was less than a block away from the bridge and the on-ramp. Bodies fell from the top by the dozens, a combination of the noise and what looked like the men shoving them off. She ran as hard as she could, occasionally glancing over to make sure there wasn't an immediate threat to her, as the falling zombies staggered to their feet after landing on their cushion. Something that was helping was that occasionally a falling zombie would land on a standing ghoul below, knocking them both over. But this wasn't always the case. Sparks continued to sprint towards the on-ramp, but had to skid to a stop just across the street from the base of it. There were easily 50 to 60 ghouls on the bottom half of the ramp. At the top, Rufus picked his targets and dropped them as quickly as he could. She stayed in hiding, taking a knee by a bush on the corner. While it did its job for the moment, it wouldn't be good for very long. She watched Rufus closely as he fired round after round, waiting for him to pause to reload. There was no path for her to make it up the ramp, as the zombies were packed too thickly. Finally, Rufus fired the last round in his magazine and began to reload. As he did, Sparks took out her handgun and fired it several times in the air to get the horde's attention. The old man's head snapped up, and he locked eyes with her for a brief moment, a silent exchange telling him exactly what needed to be done. He reached into his bag, grabbing the redneck rattler and quickly lighting it up. He threw it to his left as hard as he could, bouncing it off the pavement before finally coming to rest about 3/4 of the way down the ramp. Come on, Sparks breathed, continuing her hopeful prayer until the device detonated. The fireball and concussion from the blast was intense, the heat smacking Sparks in the face even from behind the bush 50 yards away. The blast shredded the ghouls closest to the bomb, setting fire to others and knocking most of the creatures on the ramp to the ground. She didn't waste any time, bursting out of hiding and sprinting towards the ramp. The zombies in her path started to move around, slowly picking themselves up. She did her best to dodge them, staying as far to the north bridge side of the ramp as she could. As she ran, Rufus continued to pick his targets and fire, putting down several corpses before they could get up. As she neared the final row of ghouls, some of them managed to get back to their feet. Rufus didn't dare attempt a shot with her so close, so she drew her handgun to deal with them herself. She started firing while running, not the most accurate with her shots, but she did manage to strike a couple in the head, giving her a clear path to the top. When she reached Rufus, He immediately squeezed off several more shots, picking off the ones closest to them.
"You okay, girl?" he asked.
She nodded. "Never better," she declared. He smiled and lowered his shoulder so that she could pull the extra assault rifle from his back. The couple stood there for a moment, admiring the scene in front of them, guns in hand. Between the zombies and the actions of the people of the bridge, it looked like a moderately steady waterfall of corpses plummeting to the ground.
"Never thought I'd see anything quite like that in my life," Rufus admitted. "And believe me, I've seen some serious shit."
Sparks nodded. "Definitely a first for me too," she agreed. They looked down to the landing pad, and the steady stream had created quite a cushion for the ghouls to land on. The bodies were stacked up easily 10 zombies high, and growing by the minute.
"Jesus. At this rate, it's not going to take long until they're up to the bridge," Rufus said.
Sparks checked her weapon, chambering around loudly. "Well, let's buy the time they need to get to that point," she suggested. The duo took aim and started firing, picking their targets and dropping them one by one. Back on the bridge, the trio of strong men fought hard at shoving the mass of rotting flesh over the edges of the bridge. Jeff and Rodriguez stood on the north side, while the beast with the sledgehammer stayed on the south side. Working in conjunction with this were a handful of other cartel members and Trenton, who were all using various instruments to cave in the heads and pierce skulls along the line, hoping to create some flesh padding against the barrier. Despite their best efforts, the barricade continued to strain and creak under the weight of 1,000,000 zombies pressing hard against it. While they fought, Trenton glanced back and realized zombies had begun wandering up the southern exit ramp to push against the barbed wire. "Contact on our 6!" he bellowed, and broke away from the line while the cartel members continued to battle what was in front of them. As he ran back, he counted 6 ghouls pressing against the thin line of wire. With his metal pipe firmly in his hands, he swung hard with overhead strikes, coming down hard on the ghouls. The first one slumped over the barbed wire, forcing him to take the time to push it off. The wire was more of a last resort to buy them time rather than an actual barricade, and he knew that it wouldn't take much to collapse it. He continued to swing rapidly, trying to eliminate the threat before it became too great. As he hit them hard, he could hear Sparks and Rufus unloading a lot of bullets, and his stomach sank at the realization that this operation could be in a lot of trouble. Trenton ducked back as a tall zombie reached for him, rotted fingers barely missing his face. He retaliated with an overhead strike, caving in its head and sending its hulking frame back to collapse the line all on its own. After several more swings, the immediate threat was over. Trenton ducked under the line and ran to the top of the exit ramp to see what the approaching danger looked like. He made it about 2 steps before he was forced to swing again, cracking a zombie in the side of the head as it lunged for him. He frantically looked around, entire body tense and on edge. Several dozen ghouls that had survived their falls worked their way up the ramp, the closest at 25 yards away. "Shit," he muttered. "If they get up here, we're toast." He raced back to the SUVs, opening up the backs to find anything that might be of use. He found an AR-15 and a couple of mags, and grabbed them all, rushing back to the top of the ramp. He wasn't that adept with the weapon, but he took his time and lined up his shot before pulling the trigger. He managed to hit the first few targets within 15 yards of him, before attempting one that was further away at 25. The 3 shots he tried at that distance missed. "Be patient," he thought to himself. "They'll get within range soon." He stood there, body on high alert, waiting for the threat to get within the kill zone. The group fought for the next half hour, with the gunmen keeping the ramps pacified, and the main force working on the main barricade line. Jeff, Rodriguez, and the sledgehammer-wielding beast gave another shove before all 3 were forced to step back and take a knee. Exhaustion had begun to fully set in, pain rippling through their bodies and struggling to even stand up. The trio sat on the ground staring at the line of zombies. Finally, Jeff picked himself up off of the ground, standing on his tiptoes to see over the line. The zombie horde stretched back for miles still, causing him to shake his head in disgust. Christ, it's like we haven't even put a dent in them, the skinhead groaned. Javier glanced back at the fallen trio, having heard Jeff's outburst, and gave one more big shove to get creatures over the side before turning towards them. "Hey, big fella," Javier declared. "We put a dent in them." He waved for the skinhead to come over, and Jeff pushed himself to his feet, sauntering over to inspect the situation. He looked down to see the complete flood of zombies below, reaching almost to the base of the bridge. His eyes widened. "God damn, that's a lot of fallen fuckers," he breathed. "A few thousand at least," Javier replied. "Probably the same on the other side, too." As they talked, the steady gunfire from Sparks and Rufus below fell silent. The two men looked back to see the two signaling they were out of ammo and running to meet up with the group. "Shit, that's not good," Jeff muttered. "Rodriguez!" he yelled. "We're done, man!" Rodriguez shook his head. "No, this line is holding," he replied, struggling to get back to his feet. Jeff approached him and hooked an arm under his, helping his exhausted frame to a standing. "That's all good and well, man," he said gently, "but we're about to be surrounded." The cartel leader looked back at Sparks and Rufus ducking underneath the barbed wire and rushing towards them. "We've done all we can," Sparks said, shaking her head. "We have to go."
"Those things will be up the ramp in 90 seconds, Rufus added. "If we don't go now, we aren't going."
Rodriguez let out a large sigh, growling in frustration.
"Everyone fall back to the trucks," he shouted. "Move!"
All the men immediately broke away from the line, running towards the vehicles. As they grew close to the barbed wire line, the first few zombies emerged from the north side ramp. The men ignored them completely, ducking under and racing for the vehicles. As they grew close, the cracks of Trenton's continued fire echoed in the air. Sparks broke away from the group, running in his direction, letting out a loud whistle once she was within view.
"We're leaving!"
she yelled when he turned around to look at her.
"Let's move!"
He didn't wait for an explanation, simply rushing back towards the others. They were the final ones to reach the SUVs, hopping in. Before Trenton could even close the doors, the vehicle was in reverse, speeding backwards to put some time and distance between them and the zombies. When they were a quarter-mile away, they stopped, close enough to still see the barricade. Sparks rolled down the window so she could hear. The moaning was almost deafening this close to the horde, but even with the noise they could hear the metal buckling under the pressure. At first it was just a few pops here and there, but soon it was wholesale. The group watched helplessly as the center of the barricade finally gave way, slowly opening up the path for the zombies. Only a small stream got through at the start, but with the main support structure eliminated, it didn't take long for the full flood of ghouls to go from a stream to a raging river.
"Well, we gave it a hell of an effort," Rufus said, "and didn't lose anybody, which is a goddamn miracle."
Sparks looked at her watch and nodded.
"And we bought the town 3 hours to prepare," she added.
"Let's hope they didn't squander it," Jeff murmured. The cartel vehicles turned around and started to head back. Rodriguez stopped his vehicle beside theirs, leaning out the window. "I wish we could have done more," he said, brow set in a firm line. "But it is what it is." Sparks nodded tiredly.
"By my calculation, we delayed them 3 hours," she replied.
"I hope your town uses that time wisely," Rodriguez said with a thoughtful nod.
"Same here,"
Sparks agreed. "I doubt I will be able to offer my additional help today, as I have other obligations," Rodriguez said, taking a deep breath. "However, I will be in town about this time tomorrow with a small team to help with final preparations." She looked at her watch, doing some math in her head.
"With the delay, they should be reaching us around dusk," she said.
"That's my thought as well," he replied. She gave him a sharp nod.
"Thank you," she said sincerely. "Be safe."
"You as well," he replied, and then hit the gas, speeding away to catch up with the other vehicle. The group sat in the SUV, taking one last look at the horde as it slowly worked its way towards them.
"Come on, girl,"
Rufus said softly.
"We got a lot to get done. Better get to it."
He laid a hand over hers on the shifter, and she looked over and smiled at him. Sparks nodded and put the SUV into drive, making the turn for home. Their bodies relaxed against the seats, exhausted, but still high-strung with the fear of what was on their tail.
Chapter 5. Sparks drove towards Fabens, passing the road sign that boasted exit 2 miles. The drive had been peaceful and mostly quiet. Jeff and Trenton both passed out in the back seat, but Rufus was still awake in the passenger seat, holding Sparks's hand. She kept thinking he'd nodded off, and then he'd stroke the back of her hand affectionately with his thumb, and she'd smile over at him. "Appreciate you staying up with me," she said quietly, and then smirked. "I know when people get to your age, they need the rest." He laughed, letting go of her hand to jerk his thumb over his shoulder at the other two.
"Apparently, I'm not the oldest person in the car."
He winked at her, and she joined in his laughter. He rolled his window down, hanging his arm out and letting the wind wave it like a little kid. Sparks's brow furrowed when they neared the exit, and she spotted Rodriguez's SUV pulling onto the interstate from town. "That's odd," she murmured. "He'd said he wasn't coming to town today."
"Afraid to ask what changed," Rufus added.
Sparks rolled off of the interstate, waving to the air horn scout as they drove by. He squeezed the horn, letting the town know of their arrival. As they pulled up to the command center, Leon was still standing out front, waiting for them. Sparks and Rufus got out, and their greeter immediately stiffened, brow furrowing. "Relax," Sparks said quickly. "They're just asleep in the back seat." His shoulders slumped, and he let out a sigh of relief.
"Man, I was about to say,"
he said, shaking his head.
"Rodriguez was about to have some explaining to do."
"Speaking of Rodriguez, what was he doing here?" Sparks asked, cocking her head. "What was he doing here? He told us he was needed back in the city."
"He is,"
Leon replied with a nod.
"He just came by to pick up some information for Hammond."
"So they got through the line okay?" Sparks asked, afraid to feel hope for her friends. Leon nodded again, scratching the back of his head.
"Would appear so," he replied. "Rodriguez couldn't talk because of the others in the car.
He just pulled up and took the info from me before speeding off."
"What info?"
Rufus asked.
"Just my thoughts on where I would plan an ambush," came the tired reply. "It's not much to go on, but hopefully it will help the sergeant plan the assassination." "All I know is it better work this time," Rufus declared, raising his palms. "I'm too old to be wandering the desert."
Sparks smirked at him. "You could be our Moses," she joked.
"I'm too tired for a proper comeback,"
the old man replied, giving her shoulder a playful shove. "Ethel has some coffee inside," Leon offered, jerking his thumb over his shoulder.
"Nah, I need some sleep,"
Rufus replied, the second half of his sentence cut off by a violent yawn. He stretched his arms over his head.
"Catch up with you in a couple of hours."
"Get some rest," Sparks said, giving one of his hands a reassuring squeeze before motioning to the car. "And see if you can get those guys up." Rufus smirked and walked back to the SUV. He stuck his head in through the window and took a deep breath before yelling,
"Oh my God, we're all gonna die!"
Both Jeff and Trenton shook awake violently, thrashing limbs and scrambling for weapons. Their eyes came into sharp focus on Rufus, doubled over laughing outside of the car.
"If I wasn't so tired," Jeff slurred groggily, "you'd be running for your life, old man." "Well, come get your rest then, sonny boy," Rufus drawled, "because even rested, you ain't catching shit."
Both men begrudgingly staggered out of the SUV, moving slowly towards their houses. "I got things under control here if you want to get some sleep too," Leon offered as they watched the trio go. "I know you've had a hell of a morning." Sparks shook her head. "No, I'm good," she assured him, taking a deep breath. "Just let me get some coffee and I can help out." "What needs to be done next?"
"Well, with the cartel gone for the day, I'm going to go get Rogers for a walkthrough," he explained. "Why don't you join us?"
Sparks smiled. "Sounds good," she said, and motioned for him to lead the way inside. They headed into the command center, filling up a thermos for Rogers and a paper cup for Sparks. The walk was quiet as she sucked the hot brew back fairly quickly, eyes brightening with each sip. When they reached the school, they clambered over the front barrier to get to the doors, and Leon led her towards the gymnasium. "He's staying in a gym?" she asked. "Yeah, it's kind of remarkable, actually," Leon replied. "Got him a nice little hideaway. I think it's going to take some convincing to get him to move out of it once this is over." Sparks chuckled as she followed him to the wooden structure in the corner. Leon banged on the wall, and they waited for a moment before the hidden door opened. Rogers stood in the doorway, his hair a little disheveled. "Good morning, sunshine," Leon said brightly, holding up the thermos. "I brought necessities." The detective looked past his friend at Sparks, and she held up her cup to toast him with her own brew. He blushed a little, adjusting his rumpled 3-day-old pajamas. "And company," he said, stepping out of the doorway. "Come on in. Just please excuse the mess." The duo walked inside and shut the door to the man cave. The bed wasn't made, things were scattered about, and Sparks stared around, amused, at how not a single area was even remotely clean. "So, how are we looking out there?" Rogers asked. Leon smiled. "Why don't you put some clothes on and come see for yourself?" he offered. Rogers froze, eyes widening. "Cartel?" he asked hesitantly. "Taking the day off," Leon assured him. "Apparently Tiago has them working on something big for him in El Paso. We have the run of the place today." Rogers blinked a few times, and his shoulders straightened, perking up significantly at the news. He reached for the top button of his pajamas. "Dude," Leon said, raising his hands, "I know you're eager, but show a little modesty." Rogers glanced at Sparks apologetically. "Oh, right," he said, shaking his head. "There is a lady present." "Fuck that," Leon shot back. "I was talking about me. I don't need to see your man bits." He exaggerated a shudder. "I've seen enough horror since this began." Rogers chuckled and walked back towards the door. He opened it, and the duo stepped out so he could get changed. "Be right out," he promised. As soon as the door clicked shut, the two shared a look, eyebrows raised. "Somehow I doubt you're going to have trouble getting him out of there," Sparks said, taking a long sip of her coffee. Leon shook his head. "Yeah, we might have to use this place as punishment," he joked. "I'm a little concerned that my sense of smell is permanently damaged after stepping in there." Rogers emerged, straightening his shirt and pushing his hair back into some sense of normalcy. "All right, where are we starting?" he asked. "Might as well start here," Leon replied, motioning to the gymnasium proper. "Lead on, then," the detective said with a flourish. "Despite living here, I haven't seen much outside of my box and the bathroom this week." Leon turned and led the others through the school, chatting as he went. "The gym is going to be locked off, since the doors to the outside aren't the best," he began. "They took some damage from when we cleansed the town with fire. We have them locked down as best we can, but if a big enough crowd fits it, they'll be able to get through." "So I'm going to be homeless, then?" Rogers joked. "After stepping foot in there, it's probably for the best," Leon quipped with a smirk. "Anyway, we're going to lock down the interior doors, which should do the trick." "And if not?" Rogers asked, cocking his head. Leon pointed up. "We have a fallback on the second floor," he explained. "The stairwells are open, but we'll have enough people to continually push them back down the stairs." "Sounds like fun," Rogers murmured. They moved down the hallway, peering into the classrooms as they passed. The windows were a hodgepodge of blockage, with desks bolted to the walls as barricades. "That doesn't look secure," the detective mused, pursing his lips. "They're nailed up pretty good," Leon replied sheepishly. "We have volunteers for each classroom to reinforce the ones that get pushed down. The windows are fairly high off of the ground, so even if they do manage to break them, it's going to be fairly easy to repel them." Sparks took a deep breath. "Assuming there aren't too many of them?" she said dryly.
Please tell me the defenses get a little better outside of the school, Rogers said, pressing his palms together in prayer.
They do, Leon assured him, nodding. We've put most of our attention on slowing down the horde rather than defending this position. Because, to be frank, if they get this far into town, we're in a lot more trouble than any amount of defenses is going to combat.
Sparks sighed.
I agree, she said, shaking her head. We need to keep as many of them near the interstate as possible so that they'll start heading north when we detonate the humdinger.
Rogers nodded slowly. I'm guessing that thing is ready to go? He asked.
Yep, it's rigged to blow, and we have a safe spot set aside for me after I light the fuse, she explained.
Both men turned to her with wide eyes.
Wasn't aware you were the trigger man, Leon said slowly.
Sparks tongued her cheek.
Whoever sets it off is going to have to fight through a horde to get to safety, she replied. And let's be honest, you're going to have a hard time finding someone more capable of that than me.
The men exchanged a glance and shrugged in acquiescence.
Got us there, Leon admitted.
You told Rufus yet, though? Because I get the sense he isn't going to like that too much.
Sparks wrinkled her nose. Yeah, not looking forward to that conversation, she said with a sigh. But that's future me's problem. Let's stick to the task at hand.
Of course, Leon agreed, nodding and waving for them to follow him. Come on, let's get to the front.
They headed out the front door and climbed the ladder to get over the barricade with wooden spikes sticking out. When they got back down to the ground, he turned around to allow Rogers time to admire it.
That looks formidable, he said.
Leon nodded in thanks.
Should hold up pretty good, he replied. We're hoping that the spikes on the wall will help prevent a crowd from pressing against it.
Or at the very least buy us a little more time before it collapses, Sparks added.
Rogers shook his head. Seems to be the common theme today, he murmured.
Leon led them up the road towards the drainage ditch barricade. He motioned to the houses across the street from the school. Several of them had metal sheeting on the windows with reinforced materials on the doors as well.
Rogers furrowed his brow. What's with the houses? He asked.
Contingency plan, Leon explained. If those things get to the school and surround us, we're probably going to need some help getting out. Sparks cocked her head. Are there even enough able-bodied people in this town to do that? She asked.
Hopefully you don't mind us borrowing Jeff and Rufus, Leon replied, chewing his lip for a moment. I figure we'll have both of them along, with Trenton and Clara leading teams of 3 that can cause some diversions to draw those things away from the school. We have some people who I wouldn't trust to be out in the field with you guys, but doing some limited stuff here in town, I think they can handle it. Sparks nodded sharply.
Whatever you need my group to do, she said sincerely. We're in this together.
Rogers motioned to the neighborhood, casting his eyes across the buildings. How far do the houses go back? He asked. Surely you didn't put them all on this street.
Come on, man. Give me more credit than that, Leon replied, playfully offended as he put a hand to his chest. We have 2 on this street, a couple more a few blocks over, and 1 clear on the other side of town.
Why so far away? The detective asked.
Never know when isolation will come in handy, Leon replied with a shrug. Come on, let's go check out the drainage ditch. He led them towards the next line of defense, a few blocks away. It was a few yards deep, and there was a hive of activity buzzing around it. The ditch ran the entire length of town and was covered in spikes made of every material they could find. On approach, they spotted a couple dozen citizens working on shoring up the defenses. Some sat at the top using knives to whittle broom handles into spikes, while others were in the ditch itself, digging small holes to shove them into. The spikes numbered about a dozen every yard, at multiple heights in order to capture the most creatures possible.
Welcome to our main line of defense, Leon said, spreading his arms.
Rogers looked left and right, letting out a low whistle to feign like he was impressed. He gave one of the citizens a thumbs up to keep their spirits up, and then turned away, motioning for Leon and Sparks to follow him away from the line. He lowered his voice. "That's the best we got?" he asked quietly. "Afraid so," Leon replied with a sigh, crossing his arms. "We have,
1.5 miles to defend? We simply don't have the resources in this town to make that happen. What about cars? Rogers suggested. Leon shook his head. We've used some to shore up the bridges over the ditch, he explained. Most of the rest went to the outskirts of town. These things have a tendency to wander off the road if they spot something, Sparks added. Last thing we want is for a group to see a rabbit and end up waltzing into town from our undefended flank. Even a group of 100 could cause issues. Rogers shook his head, letting out a grunt of frustration. Sorry, I know it's not you guys, he said with a heavy sigh. I'm just frustrated at the situation. We know, man. It's all good, Leon said, clapping his friend on the shoulder. We're in the same boat with you. How effective do you think those spikes are going to be? The detective asked. Realistically? Leon and Sparks exchanged a worried look, silently debating numbers with just their gazes. Finally, the former turned back to his friend. Depends on how many we can draw away from the main column of them, he said. Sparks took a deep breath. We could get a couple of runners on this side of things to spread them out a bit, she added. The thinner the line coming across the ditch, the longer it's going to hold out. Still didn't answer my question, Rogers pointed out. Leon scratched the back of his head nervously. Spitballing here? Maybe 30 minutes, maybe 90 minutes, he said. Just going to depend on how many start stacking up and pushing through. Although, if you have a better idea, you're more than welcome to put it forward, Sparks suggested. Rogers shrugged, raising his hands. What about setting the pit on fire? He asked. She shook her head. Sure, if you want to bring more of those things off of the interstate, she countered. The horde isn't getting here until dark tomorrow, Leon added. Those things love bright lights. We set a fire that size and they'll be all over us. Sparks nodded, taking back the conversation. Which is why we have to wait to detonate the humdinger, she explained. If we set it off too early, we run the risk of pulling a lot more of them off of the interstate. They're just going to wander out into the desert, Rogers finally cut in. So not sure what the big deal is. Leon shook his head. I don't know about you, but I would sleep a lot sounder knowing there weren't 50,000 zombies wandering around to the north that could easily come our way if one of them got turned around, he drawled. Rogers sighed and gave a begrudging nod. Valid point, he said. Come on, Leon continued. Got something else to show you. He led them to the bridge, and they climbed over the barricade. They moved up to the command center, and he skirted it into the parking lot out back. There stood 6 cars parked in groups of 2 side by side. Leon pointed to multiple strands of thick barbed wire running from the hood of one vehicle and connecting to the back of the next one. Metal posts stuck out of the vehicles that the wire was attached to. This, Rogers said, eyebrows rising, looks interesting. Once it's time, we're going to move them up to the road, leading to town, Leon explained. We figure if we stretch this out across the road, it'll take some of them out as they push through it. The detective nodded thoughtfully. Anything that buys us time, right? Now you're getting it, Sparks commended with a smile. Every minute counts, Leon added. Rogers took a deep breath, linking his fingers behind his head and stretching his back. So, any idea how long it's going to take the horde to pass us by on the interstate? He asked. Anywhere from 3 to 4 hours, Leon replied, tilting his hand back and forth. The detective let out a low whistle, this time a genuine holy shit sound, shaking his head. That's a long-ass time to be under siege, he said dryly. Let's hope this stuff holds them up. And if things get too hairy, we can just set Jeff loose with a sledgehammer and let him have a good time, Sparks cut in. Rogers couldn't help but laugh. Good to have backup plans, I suppose, he said. If it gets to that point, Leon said, then we're all going to be hacking away at these things. Rogers nodded. Sounds like regardless of what happens, we're going to have a hell of a day tomorrow, he said, clucking his tongue. So what do you say we all get together for a sit-down dinner this evening? As long as it's not at your place, I'm in, Sparks replied, raising her hand. Leon burst out laughing. Thank you, he said, shaking his head. I didn't want to be the one to say it.
Rogers chuckled. Yeah, I know. My place does need to air out a bit, he agreed, waving them off. You set it up and just let me know where. Sparks shook her empty paper cup. I need a refill, she declared. I'll ask Ethel and let you know. She gave them a wave and sauntered off to the front of the building, leaving the two men alone in the parking lot. Rogers approached one of the cars, flicking one of the metal pipes sticking up from the hood to create a nice ping noise. Gotta say, he drawled, I never pegged you as the MacGyver type. I'd love to take credit for that, Leon admitted, but this is all Rufus. He waved his hand with a flourish at the modded line of cars. The detective smirked. Never underestimate redneck ingenuity. Especially in the apocalypse, his friend agreed. I mean, you know you're in good hands with a man like that when he has all the skill set he does, and still has all his fingers. Both men burst out laughing, Rogers pretending to wipe tears from his eyes. All kidding aside, he said as he finally caught his breath. I am kind of sad we're not going to see that humdinger go up. Never seen a bus being exploded from 1,000 gallons of fuel and explosives. Leon put a nonchalant hand on his hip. Oh, I may have found some video cameras when doing inventory, he said innocently. Borrowed the solar charger to get the batteries good to go. We're getting that shit from multiple angles. The detective let out a whoop and extended his fist for a bump. Leon obliged him, and they shared a chuckle. Shaking their heads, they leaned back against the hood of the car, falling into a comfortable silence, despite the thoughts of the battle to come racing through their heads. Chapter 6. Night fell as the three soldiers sat in the living room of Marcella's house. Hammond stared at a blueprint of the target building where Mathis was being held. Landry and Whitaker were on opposite sides of the room, tossing a padded football back and forth. Sarge, how long are you going to keep staring at that thing? Landry asked as he fired the ball at his partner. Hammond didn't look up from the paper. Until I'm sure we have the best course of action, he muttered. Sarge, we have the plan down pat, Whitaker said with a sigh as she shot the football, aiming for her companion's face. Landry is going to cover the front entrance, while the two of us go in through the back and wipe every last one of those motherfuckers off the face of the earth. Anybody tries to escape and Landry takes them down. The private in question caught the ball before it smushed into his nose, and then tossed it back and forth between his hands before shaking his head. Only thing I don't like about the plan is that I'm probably not going to get to kill too many of those torturing assholes. Just concerned about the side of the building, Hammond said in a monotonous tone. If one person gets away, we lose our shot at Tiago. Sarge, I know you're concerned, Landry said with a sigh, lowering his hands and turning towards the coffee table. But there's only 3 of us, so we have to go with the best odds. Whitaker nodded, crossing her arms. As much as I'm loath to admit it, she added, Landry is right. He smirked. That hurt you, didn't it? He teased. More than you know, she drawled, and then raised her hand with lightning-fast speed as he whizzed the ball back at her with a chuckle. She caught it easily and fired it back. One person going into that building alone isn't going to stand much of a chance, she continued. Hell, 2 of us going in is going to be a tall order, especially since we don't know how many guards are in there. And I'll make sure to take up positions so I can see the sides of the building, Landry assured the sergeant. Anybody sneaks out a window and they're getting pegged. Whitaker nodded firmly. We're going to make this happen, Hammond, she said. The sergeant stared at the map for another few moments before finally shoving it away. As he sat back on the couch, Whitaker tossed the football to him. He caught it and stared at it for a moment, tossing it up in the air to himself before throwing it to Landry. I swear, he said with a sigh. The worst part about all of this is the waiting. I just want to get in there and get it over with. Landry smirked. Hey, Whitaker, he drawled as he faked a throw. Didn't the last guy you pick up at the bar say the same thing about you? Could ask you the exact same question, she shot back. and the private whipped the ball at her with such force she pretended that it hurt when she caught it. Hammond finally cracked a smile at their banter. Before they could continue, however, the garage door opened. The trio perked up, all at attention and ready to grab their guns at a moment's notice. They all relaxed when they saw it was Marcella, the lady of the house. She paused in the doorway, brow furrowing. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Sorry, force of habit," Landry replied as they all sank back into their seats. Marcella waved them off. "No need to apologize," she assured them. "I've spent years living with the cartel, so I am the same way."
"Speaking of the cartel,"
Hammond said, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees,
"did any of your contacts come through?"
She snapped her fingers. "Several, as a matter of fact," she replied. "One of them provided me with a device I think will be of much use to you tomorrow." "What you got?" Whitaker asked, leaning forward. "For lack of a better term, I have a signal jammer," Marcella replied. "So when you go in to rescue your friend, you can make sure they can't call for backup." Landry raised his palms high above his head. "I think I'm okay with sacrificing my kill streak if it means we don't get overwhelmed with reinforcements," he declared. "Thank you, Landry, for your self-sacrifice," Whitaker deadpanned. "Truly noble of you." She gave a few sarcastic claps, and Landry shot her a wolfish grin. "Just doing my part," he said brightly.
"Thank you, Marcella,"
Hammond said sincerely.
"That will be extremely valuable. Anything else?"
She smiled before setting down the bag she'd been carrying and rummaging around inside. She pulled out a map and spread it out on the counter. The soldiers, intrigued, got up from their seats and joined her at the island, gathering around to look at a crudely drawn bridge.
"All right, what are we looking at?"
Hammond asked slowly. Marcella pointed to the picture. "This is where Tiago Rivas is going to hold his viewing party," she said. There was a huge circle on the map, with the interstate cutting through the center and running under the bridge. To the north there were two building markers, one with an X and one with an O on it. On the south side was a taller building marker with an exclamation point.
"I'm guessing those notes mean something?"
Hammond prompted. Marcella nodded. "Yes. Rodriguez had your friend Leon take a look at the site on his satellite to get his take on the situation," she explained. "These markings indicate where he thinks the most likely ambush points are." The trio of soldiers looked at the map for a time, and then eventually nodded in agreement, sharing glances. "Leon probably has a better idea of what these buildings actually look like," Whitaker said, "as well as the road and visibility conditions." Landry nodded thoughtfully. "Even so," he replied, "just looking at their locations, this would be my thought as well. That north side building is probably ripe for an ambush spot," Whitaker continued, tapping the spot with her fingernail. "Why not just flank us, though?" Landry wondered. Marcella leaned forward. "Crossfire would be my assumption," she suggested. "This bridge doesn't have a ramp to the interstate, so it will be very difficult to take up firing positions on it if you have men firing back at you." Landry nodded. "Makes sense," he agreed.
"What is this exclamation point?"
Hammond asked. "Ah, yes. This is a 4-story building, tallest one in the area," Marcella explained. "Based on what he sees on the satellite imagery, this is going to be the spot to place your sniper, assuming, of course, that he is in good enough condition to shoot." Landry bristled, and Hammond immediately put a hand on his shoulder to calm him down. Marcella raised her palms. "And please understand, I meant no insult regarding your man," she said quickly. "I'm sure he is resilient. However, I know the men working on him are just as determined to do their jobs. I also say it because we have a plan for the possibility that he will be unable to be an effective shooter. This is a war, and if we don't execute this plan properly, none of us will see the next day." Landry let out a deep whoosh of breath and nodded, leaning back over the map. "So, Sarge, what are you thinking?" he asked. Hammond studied the map for a moment before glancing at Marcella.
"Any idea what the ambush party is going to consist of?"
he asked. She shook her head. "In this situation, no," she replied. I can only speak of prior situations." "This has happened before?" Whitaker asked, raising an eyebrow. "In a manner of speaking, yes," the hostess admitted. "I will spare you the details, however. Tiago presented himself as bait to take down a vicious rival. He had 20 men waiting to protect him, as well as 2 snipers."
"Oh, is that all?" Landry asked in a high-pitched voice. "For a minute there, I thought this was going to be difficult." He threw up his hands.
"We faced longer odds," Whitaker said.
Landry stared at her unblinking, and she wrinkled her nose.
"Not often," she amended, "but we have."
"Do you know what their tactics are?" Hammond asked.
Marcella shook her head.
"Only indirectly," she admitted. "My husband was a part of the ambush team. He told me some of the battle, and while it would not surprise me to learn he embellished his role in it, I believe the tactics were real."
The trio stiffened at the mention of a husband, glancing nervously between them.
"Marcella,"
Hammond asked slowly,
"is us launching an attack on the ambush team going to be an issue?"
She furrowed her brow in confusion until she realized what he was implying and waved a hand at him.
"Oh, my husband. No, she assured them. "He died last year, so you won't have to worry about facing him."
The group relaxed, and Hammond reached out and rested a hand over hers.
"My apologies," he said, "and condolences."
"It is okay," she replied, patting his hand once before extracting her own and leaning back over the map. "Now, back to our task."
"Of course,"
the sergeant said.
"On that day, they launched a blitz attack from a single location," Marcella continued, "storming out in groups of 4 and creating a massive firing line. With the battlefield set up in the way that it is, they will most likely attempt to do it again."
Landry cocked his head. "Wouldn't Tiago get caught in the fire that way?"
"He will have his 2 bodyguards with him," she explained, shaking her head, "and they will have him pinned on the ground beneath him at the first sign of trouble."
"If they get that firing line out, we're not going to be able to deal with it," Whitaker cut in.
"Mathis or no Mathis."
"Agreed,"
Hammond said with a heavy sigh.
"Which means we're going to have to boil the egg before it hatches."
Landry scratched the back of his head. "That's going to be a tall order, Sarge," he said. "First sign of fire and they're going to book it out of there."
"Just means one of us will have to keep Tiago's attention," the sergeant said.
Whitaker blinked at him.
"What are you going to do?" she asked.
"Just walk up to him and say, 'Howdy'?"
"In a manner of speaking, yeah,"
Hammond replied with a nod.
"With Mathis, we can take down the snipers and I'll have cover."
The privates exchanged a glance and then nodded in agreement. It was a solid plan.
"Forgive me if I get this saying wrong," Marcella cut in, "but I believe you Americans say, 'You have quite the balls on you.'"
The trio of soldiers laughed, shaking their heads.
"That is close enough,"
Hammond finally said, offering her a smile.
"And yes, it would appear as though I do."
Whitaker took a deep breath, back on task.
"Do we have any explosives?" she asked.
Marcella thought for a moment, and then finally shook her head.
"Unfortunately, no, we do not," she replied. "They are in extremely limited supply, and there is a close eye kept on them."
Whitaker turned to Landry. "Think Molotovs will work?" she asked. "You want to set the building we're running into on fire?" he asked, gaping at her.
Whitaker shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time," she said.
"Damn it," Landry said with a defeated sigh. "I'm going to lose my eyebrows again, aren't I?"
"Look at it like this," she replied. "There ain't a woman within 100 miles that you have a shot with anyway, so it's not like it's going to hurt anything."
"God damn it," Landry huffed. "Fine. Molotovs it is." Whitaker smirked and then turned back to Marcella.
"Can you get us glass bottles and something flammable?" she asked. "You will have it first thing in the morning," the hostess promised.
"Okay, we have our plan," Hammond said. "Everybody take 5, then meet in the living room to start going over breach plans for the ambush team."
Landry raised his hands. "We're just going to make up plans, Sarge?"
"Yep. Every layout type we can think of, we're going to have a plan for."
The sergeant replied with a sharp nod. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "What else do you have to do, Landry?" she drawled. He shrugged. "Take one last longing look at my luxurious eyebrows before you burn them off?" he suggested. Hammond rolled his eyes with a sigh.
"Fine. Take 10. Then we get started."
The group shared a much-needed laugh and broke from the kitchen to take a breather before getting back to work. Despite the seriousness of the task at hand, they fared well in good spirits, looking forward to getting Mathis back and finishing what they started with Tiago Rivas. The end. Up next, the Battle of Van Horn rages as the survivors struggle to combat the marching horde of zombies in El Paso, Creeping Death, Part 6.